I want to start, Larry, with something you tweeted last night. You wrote, does the president control his administration? New IRS commissioner this week. Appointment revoked today. Declaration of legal war against Harvard last weekend labeled a mistake today. Tariffs relaxed, all attributed to absence of one advisor. Evil and incompetence are hard to disentangle. Who is in charge? So we're going to talk about all those subjects, but let me ask you about the question you raised, Larry. Is this incompetence, something more sinister, or in your view, a combination of both?
I think it must be both. On the one hand, there's clearly an aspiration to subvert all kinds of democratic institutions that we have in the country. We've got money arbitrarily being taken out of people's bank accounts. We've got people being deported to countries with no process. We've got people who've relied on the federal government for everything, for support for research projects to necessary anti-poverty subsistence, suddenly being taken away. We've got government computer systems with our most sensitive data from our tax system being turned over to 22-year-old would-be capitalists from Silicon Valley. We have our traditional allies being rhetorically trashed and being sold out in international deals. That all can't be by accident. That's judgments that are being made by our president, and they're wrong. But it's also true that they're just huge gang who can't shoot straight aspects, and that the president isn't in control. If the president were in control, just trying to serve any objective, he wouldn't put in place the tariff regime one day and withdraw much of it 4 or 5 days later. He wouldn't allow his administration to send a highly publicized letter to the nation's oldest university and then allow people in his administration to be telling the press that it had just been a mistake. He would decide, he might decide on someone who I couldn't stand to be head of the IRS, but we're now on our fifth commissioner of the IRS because of the people he forced to resign, because Elon Musk appointed a IRS commissioner without consulting with the Treasury Secretary, and then the Treasury Secretary got the president to unappoint that acting IRS commissioner a day later. So just because there's evil is not a reason to presume there's competence or coherence. This is unlike anything I have ever seen before, and I don't think it's in the context of the American historical experience. You know, Katie, unlike many of your listeners, I'm old enough to remember when Richard Nixon was president and we had Watergate. Here's the difference. Richard Nixon knew the difference between right and wrong. That's why when he did wrong, he tried to hide it, not shout it from the treetops. We now have a president who, when he's doing wrong, he's invading the federal payment system, he's violating the law by cutting off payments, he's extorting lawyers for defending clients. He says it as loudly and as widely and as publicly as he can in order to intimidate other people. And so this is a different step than anything what Nixon was doing. Nixon was paying tribute to virtue by obscuring what he was doing. We now have a president who is celebrating vice by glorying in his acts of illegality.
You you mentioned Richard Nixon, and I saw a clip of J.D. Vance saying Nixon was right when he said university professors are the enemy.
Look, I don't know quite what to say. Are many university presidents enemies of this political uh, project, if you can call it that, that President Trump and J.D. Vance are involved in? Yeah, many university professors are. Are they right to be concerned that the academy is tilted towards certain political perspectives and away from others? Yeah, frankly, I think that is a legitimate concern, and I think it demands much more attention than it's received from universities like Harvard. But does that mean that presidents of the United States are supposed to have enemies lists? Are supposed to try to scare people that they'll get put on the enemies list if they avail themselves of their First Amendment rights? No, that's not what's right in America. So I don't want to at all whitewash or suggest that there haven't been all kinds of problems of a progressive establishment, of which in many ways I've been a part, and which Harvard is a part over many years. But God, if history teaches anything, it's that the ends don't always justify the means. And even if that's a legitimate concern, what's going on here is appalling.
Well, the MO seems to be to use an electric chainsaw instead of a scalpel. And that is also true in the case of Harvard. As you mentioned, they're now saying this letter threatening Harvard was a mistake, that it wasn't authorized to be sent. But let's talk about the substance of these demands. Columbia cut a deal. The president of Harvard, Alan Garber, said basically, Larry, pound sand, that the demands overstep the power of the federal government. He said, quote, the university will not surrender its independence or relinquish its constitutional rights. Some of the demands that were made of Harvard, and I think this is important because I want people to have a deeper understanding of what was happening here. Some of the demands included changing the governance of the leadership to reduce the power of students, faculty, and administrations more committed to activism than scholarship, end all preferences based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in its hiring, and review existing faculty for plagiarism and similar preferences in admissions process, stop all DEI programs, change admissions processes, quote, to prevent admitting students hostile to the American values and institutions inscribed in the U.S. Constitution and Declaration of Independence, bring in an external party approved by the federal government to audit the groups within the school for diverse ideological viewpoints, create a process for any Harvard affiliate to report noncompliance to university leadership and the federal government. um, you know, the university shall make organizational changes to ensure full transparency and cooperation with all federal regulators. So you can see that it's basically the overreach of the federal government into these private universities. What was your reaction when you read some of the demands that are being made by the Trump administration, not just to Harvard, but to so many colleges and universities across the country?
It depends on from what moment I view it. In an immediate sense, I was appalled, but I was not completely astounded. If you just had listened to what the president had been saying, it was pretty clear that he was spoiling for this fight. that he very much wanted to have this kind of war uh, with uh, with colleges, whether it's born out of his own resentments as a young person, whether it's a reflection of where he thinks many voters are, whether he's trying to tap into a deep stream that many of our universities seem like they're concerned with everything except the promotion of ordinary middle class Americans, and he was trying to tap into that. At some level, I wasn't amazed that he would overreach. He always does. But to say I wasn't amazed is not to say that I wasn't alarmed. And you can't imagine a university in a democratic free country like the United States where every student is getting audited for what their beliefs are before they're admitted, before you, when you decide who's going to be in a faculty senate or a faculty committee, you have to ask a bunch of questions about their ideology first. This isn't the stuff of America.
Why philosophically is this so abhorrent to you, if that's not too strong a word?
Because what I believe, as much as I believe anything else, is that we get closer to truth through free and open argument, through letting people with different perspectives assert their perspectives, and then see who wins the argument, see what emerges from the marketplace of ideas. And if you say that you're not allowed to make certain kinds of claims, if you say that there can only be one kind of institution that operates in one kind of way, you're limiting and cutting out all of that. Think about what it would mean if we could only have government approved cars designed in a certain way. People couldn't invent new kinds of cars, all that. That would really make it much worse to be buying cars, but that would just be cars. If it's the ideas that are going to shape the rest of our society, if it's what young people are going to learn, one size fits all, set by somebody who doesn't know anything, about most of the subjects, that it seems to me is a prescription for regress rather than progress.
And
Look, we've known and Americans have rejected for decades the idea of burning books, the idea of burning books that we don't like. This is much worse than that. If you burn books, or you find it somewhere else, you get it somewhere else, you read a different book. If you say a college can only teach one way or only admit one kind of people, that is a very, very different thing. And look, Katie, I am not somebody who is way tied to the way things are in these institutions. I understand why the Supreme Court would have made a decision that affirmative action policies at this point have become problematic, and admissions should be done in a different way. That's certainly how voters have voted in many different referenda. So I'm not saying that these institutions should be left alone entirely. Their actions should be subject to judicial review. We should have laws in the country that they have to follow, just like all of us do. But that's very different from treating them in the way that universities are treated in dictatorship countries.
Yeah, it's ironic for an administration that ostensibly believes deeply in free speech would be doing this to, as you said, one of the oldest universities. You know, you have said that every act of capitulation makes the next one more likely. Do you think are the broader consequences when institutions like Columbia yield to pressure from the Trump administration?
I think that fear is fear is contagious, Katie. And when people, when nobody knows quite what to do in any of these situations, and then when they see other people are too afraid to resist, they think maybe I should be too afraid uh, to um, to resist. When there are a lot of cars going down the road, and you see a lot of people making a U-turn, you may not understand exactly why that's happening, but you think you should make a U-turn too. When you see everybody taking their money out of the bank, you don't frequently try to stop and really understand what's happening. You decide you need to get your money out of the bank. And that's what happens when you start seeing capitulations on a large scale. And it works the other way. Um,
There's
that's
solidarity
why
and courage.
when there's courage and when there's resistance, first it's one person, then it's more people. I'm not that given to following political rhetoric, but I remember many, many years ago reading a speech that Robert Kennedy had given when he had gone to Robert Kennedy, the father, I hasten to say, not our current cabinet secretary, had gone to South Africa. And he spoke about when a stone was thrown into a pond, there were concentric circles, waves that spread and spread and spread, and that acts of courage had that kind of consequence as well. And I think those who are most visible should feel the greatest obligation uh, to be strong and accept risk. And in many ways, that's the obligation and responsibility that comes from good fortune. That's
Yeah.
why a couple of weeks ago I called on Harvard to resist and said, what was the point of having a $52 billion endowment? It wasn't so it could be admired or envied, but it could be used to do really important things. And there wasn't something more important than resisting.
Well, let me ask you about that endowment. At 50, I know it's over 50, so $52 billion. And some people wonder what it would mean if the government revoked Harvard's $2.2 billion in federal funding. Um, so are you saying that that would not impact Harvard that much?
Of course, it would impact Harvard, but I think the crucial question would be the length of time. If it happened for a limited interval before Harvard won in court, I think it is something that is quite manageable. If it was a permanent breakdown of research funding, I think that would be catastrophic. It would be catastrophic in part, and this is what people have emphasized and talked about, because if we stop doing medical research, we stop making progress against diseases, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's, what have you. But that's not the only kind of new knowledge we produce in great universities. If you think about where the underlying concepts and ideas that have led to the very different ideas we have about equality in the United States come from, that's come a great deal from scholars and philosophers. if you think about the approaches we take to what the best ways of dealing with the environment are, um, those in important ways came from universities. To take an example from my field, we used to have things like the Depression, where the unemployment rate got to 25%. We've got plenty of economic problems today, but we don't have that one to that extent. And that's a lot because John Maynard Keynes, a professor in a university, formulated a theory and wrote a book and made a set of arguments. And then we understand the world better, and then it worked better. And if we threaten all of that, I think the consequences are potentially very grave.
And we're talking about 800 million taken from Johns Hopkins. We're talking about $1 billion taken from the end of federal funding for Cornell. And as you said, this involves so much research, not just in critically important life-saving medical research, but all kinds of research. I wanted to ask you, Larry, about something you tweeted about the Treasury Department directing the IRS to consider revoking its tax exempt status to Harvard. You said, any self-respecting Treasury Secretary would resign rather than have the department be complicit in the weaponization of the IRS against a political adversary of the president. Harvard will endure, and it is far, far from perfect. But if this directive is not withdrawn, the administration will have taken another substantial step away from the rule of law and democracy. What do you think are the long-term consequences of using the IRS or any government agency as a political weapon like this?
We become 1960s or 1970s or 1980s Argentina rather than America. We become a place where everybody says the same thing, which is what they think will ingratiate themselves with the person who is the leader, who will succeed themselves with no legitimate election campaign. We become much poorer. We become much dumber. We become less influential in the world. We become more likely to blunder into wars. We stop being the United States that all of us have known.
I want to talk to you about Jerome Powell in a moment, but as a former Treasury Secretary, I heard many positive things, Larry, about Scott Bessant, how he was an independent thinker, a very high-minded individual. What do you think of his leadership thus far?
I think it's very difficult, Katie, to make judgments when you don't see the whole situation. And those of us on the outside don't see the whole situation. But I have to say, I have been surprised by the degree of White House intrusion he has he has allowed in the IRS. I have been surprised by the amount of Elon Musk Doge intrusion he has allowed in the federal payments systems. I have been surprised by some of the things he has said. He said at one point that he thought the president deserved a Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, for his activities with respect to Russia and Ukraine. And I found that a very odd thing for a Treasury Secretary to say about the president they worked for, even apart from the merits of the proposition, which I obviously think are dubious, just because one wants the Treasury Secretary to have a sense of independence rather than a sense of sycophancy. Um, but again, he is doing a lot of things internally. There are stories that have come out suggesting that he has been able to resist some of the worst excesses of this policy. And one of the things that I've learned in life rather painfully is that problematic can very easily get worse. And while I've certainly got my reservations about things the Treasury Secretary has done, it's not like I couldn't imagine figures as Donald Trump's Treasury Secretary who would be far, far, far more problematic for me
Yeah.
than Scott Bessent.
I want to ask you about Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Trump attacked him on Truth Social, saying Powell's termination cannot come fast enough and telling reporters, quote, if I want him out, he'll be out there real fast, believe me. His term isn't up until May of next year, 2026. He was appointed by Donald Trump in his first term. Taking a step back, what was your reaction to these kinds of attacks? And can you explain why it is so important, as you mentioned, the Treasury Secretary having a degree of independence? Why is it so important to have an independent Fed?
So it's so important to have an independent Fed because you can always goose the economy up by printing a lot of money and lowering interest rates and having there be an ocean of liquidity. Boats will rise when you do that. The problem is then there'll be a collapse afterwards, and you'll have much higher prices, and you'll have much more inflation. And it's always tempting to do that if you've got a really short horizon, as politicians facing reelection do. And that's why in almost every major country, we take monetary policy, we take the work of the Fed out from immediate political control and put it in an independent institution. And the decision to do that is a substantial part of the reason why inflation is much lower in almost every country over the last two generations than it was in the generation of the 1970s before that kind of political innovation had been put in place. So I think that's something that the vast majority of economists accept as a good idea and should accept as a good idea. Katie, I don't know what the president will ultimately do. I can't predict what this president does. When previous presidents in the administrations I served in, they would get frustrated. They would wonder why the Fed couldn't do what it seemed to them would be helpful in the short run. And I remember saying to President Clinton, Mr. President, for you to bash the Fed would be a fool's game. The Fed would not listen, and so they would not cut the federal funds rate, which they control. But the market would listen, get scared, and accept higher inflation. And so long term interest rates, mortgage rates for households would go up. So, whatever it is we want to accomplish, I don't think we'll accomplish it by bashing the Fed. And I
Can
think the same thing is true in this administration. And, I hope cooler heads will
well,
prevail.
well,
Look,
can
it
Trump,
comes back.
Larry?
Can I just say one thing, Katie?
Yeah,
It comes
sure.
back to this thing that I remarked on at the beginning about evil and incompetence. The president says all this stuff, and markets at the moment hardly twitch. And it, on the one hand, like I think maybe they should be more alarmed. On the other hand, it's something very problematic about our country when the president of the United States has worked himself into a place where he talks and people don't take him seriously. And that raises this whole question of buffoonery being an aspect of this situation as well as malevolence.
That's true. when the president loses his power to use the bully pulpit and people don't know how seriously to take him, not to mention his unpredictability on tariffs. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But a couple quick questions about the Fed. Can Trump fire Jerome Powell? And he reportedly is starting to interview people. So is he creating some kind of shadow Fed chairman? And what are the implications of that?
We don't really know. I don't think he can legally fire Jerome Powell over disagreement. If Jerome Powell had committed a serious crime, he probably could, but fire him for no cause other than disagreement, I think the law is relatively clear that he cannot. Um, Will some shadow, something or other, have an effect on perceptions in markets? I think that's very hard to judge because sometimes markets take this president very seriously and sometimes they tune him uh, out. So it's hard to know the answer. But when you're around delicate machinery, when there's really delicate, really complicated, really important machinery, you really don't want any mechanic near it who you don't sense respects the machinery and understands it. And the economy is a pretty sensitive, pretty complicated machine. And we've got somebody near it who neither respects it nor has a deep understanding of it and who seems driven by impulse and instinct rather than analysis and reason. And my reading of history is that leaders who are driven by impulse and instinct can do very great damage.
You know, I wonder if Trump could conceivably, Larry, put somebody like Stephen Miller in charge of the Fed and try to make it, in essence, an arm of the executive branch, just as he's trying to do with the Department of Justice.
You know, an important issue for our country is going to be the behavior of Republicans in the Senate and whether those in the president's party who know how aberrant this is are going to be prepared to resist, deny confirmation in cases that are extreme, do some of the kinds of things that Senator Joe Manchin did during the Biden
Well,
administration.
we're not
I've been
seeing a lot of that,
we're
Larry,
not we
so
have not
far.
seen, we have not seen a lot yet. I have greatly admired a number of things that Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska have
But
done.
she
I've
just
been,
said in a town hall meeting that she's scared and everyone's scared. And it's sort of like, uh, that was very frustrating and I think unnerving for a lot of people to see about the impact threats are having on all these Republicans, and real threats that I've heard about that are like almost mafia like.
I can't I can't disagree with you, and that's why I think this is a very difficult moment for our country. And what we have to hope is for people to be courageous and be prepared to speak out and be prepared to cast necessary votes. Look, this is not a new issue in America. John Kennedy um, helped propel himself to the presidency by writing a book called Profiles in Courage that was about senators who stood up against the misbegotten tides of their times and cast votes that were very unpopular. And I kind of think that that book ought to be required reading in parts of the United States Senate today.
Yeah, we haven't seen a lot of those emerge from the Republican Party. I want to end, well, I have a few questions about tariffs if you have time for me. I don't want to keep you from the golf course, Larry,
A few
but
more. Just a few more, Katie. Happy to do it.
um, let me ask you about tariffs because you've called Trump's tariffs, quote, the worst self inflicted wound through economic policy since the Second World War. Why?
It Look, we all know that when there's a big increase in the price of oil, that's bad for us. It's bad for us because consumers have to pay more, so there's more inflation. It's bad for us because consumers can afford to buy fewer of other things because of the oil they're buying. This is the same idea as that. Things we import are being made much more expensive, only instead of it being done from the outside by OPEC, it's being done by us to ourselves. This is like a $40 a barrel increase in the price of oil. It's like if oil jumped all of a sudden from 60 to 100 or 110. Nobody would think that was other than terrible for the economy. And the immediate economic effect of this is very similar. So it's what economists call a supply shock. Prices up, lower quantity, it's higher inflation and lower unemployment. And it's also, in important respects, screwing ourselves. You know, Katie, there are more than 60 times as many people who work in steel using industries as work in steel industry. So when we do this, we might save some number of steel jobs, but we're making all those industries like cars, like home building, that rely on steel less competitive and more expensive. And that just doesn't seem like a very smart thing for us to do as a country. You
You
could
say
debate,
we're acting more like that America has switched its pattern from being a bastion of strength to trading like an emerging market.
yeah, you see that, you see it in the pattern in markets. Traditionally, when things get a bit scary, stocks go down, but people decide they want to hold treasuries. And so the yield on treasuries goes down as more and more people try to buy them. Now, stocks go down, treasuries go down, the dollar goes down. It's like what happened to Turkey with Erdogan, or what happens not infrequently to various Latin American countries when emerging markets become submerging uh, markets. But what's especially weird and unusual about this moment is this isn't something the markets are doing to us. This isn't something that's happening because of some bad external shock. This is something we're doing to ourselves.
Well, that the administration is doing to us. I don't
Yeah,
think
it's
we're doing it
our
to us,
government.
right?
Yeah, it's something that our president is doing to our country.
And you say, I know that, a lot of Trump apologists say, hey, he ran on this, but you've pointed out that his tariff agenda has gone way beyond anything he said during the campaign. Triple digit tariffs on China, sweeping penalties on small African countries. So do you think Trump's defenders are starting to realize how over the top and dangerous this is?
I hope they are. Um, and I suspect some of the more thoughtful ones have come to a realization of, what did I create? What have I enabled some time ago, would be my best guess. Um, Look, there was this phrase that got all around. You should take him seriously, but not literally. He's not going to do all the stuff he says. Well, he's actually gone way beyond what he talked about in the campaign. He never talked about putting tariffs on uninhabited islands that had only penguins during his campaign. He never talked about putting epically high tariffs on countries that were pseudo threats to the United States, like Lesotho. He never talked about having tariff rates above 100% on China. He didn't really talk about blowing up the entire transatlantic alliance that has been the whole centerpiece of the way the United States has thought about the world and thought about resisting communism since the end of the Cold War. So this has gone way beyond even what he talked about in the campaign. And the people who tried to legitimate him by comparing him to the errors of past presidents. And God knows there were people in the Biden administration who were furious at me for warning that Biden's policies might create inflation. There are people at Harvard who are furious at me for having said that the university has a real problem with anti-Semitism. So I'm not saying that which he was reacting against was perfect or unflawed. But this is a step into places that I never thought our country would go. And my desperate hope for my children and my grandchildren's sake is that we will step back.
You said, Larry, this goes way beyond economic blunder. This is not an economic blunder motivated by poor economic thinking. This is an agenda about power, about crony capitalism that's having highly perverse economic consequences. And it is tragic. What do you mean exactly when you talk about crony capitalism?
I mean that part of the difference between real mature democracies like the United States was and other countries with much less well-functioning political system is if you want to sell things to the government, how much is it about having the best product at the lowest cost, and how much of it is about how much you contributed to the president's last campaign? If you want to, if you're enforcing the law, how much is it about whether you did or did not commit a crime? And how much is it whether you're a friend of the president? Whether you are a country governed by the rule of law or by a law of rules based on who the cronies are of those in power is a very fundamental thing. And God knows we're not perfect. And you can point to instances of political contributors being rewarded or instances of things that are problematic in most administrations. But we have never seen anything like the degree of fear and adjustment on the part of the business community that we are seeing right now. And I hope as the business community um, collects itself and finds collective strength, and I hope as they think not just about their most immediate interests, but their longer run interests, that there will be some back off and change from these policies.
Yeah, because some of the defenders say these tariffs are necessary to reset an unfair global trade system. Is there any version of this strategy using tariffs that could actually work in your view?
I'm, Katie, a person who's pretty down the line in favor of relatively free trade, the way we advocated it during the Clinton administration and during the Obama administration. That's my view. There are people I respect who are thoughtful, who think that for various reasons it's important to be much more aggressive about threatening using tariffs in various ways on other countries to get them to treat our producers right. I'm less of a believer in those policies, but that's a reasonable argument, like Democrats and Republicans usually have, like people in the US Senate within a political party usually have about the right way forward. And while I think I'm right, I recognize that others disagree and that you need to have an approach that reflects multiple perspectives and compromise. That, that is not what these policies are about. These policies are outside any kind of mainstream of respectable opinion. And we've seen the market judgment on them. The market judgment, depending on just how you measure it, is that the cumulative cost to the economy, not the cost to corporations, which is the least of it, the bigger costs are the costs to workers and customers, are measured comfortably in the trillions of dollars.
What is your long-term what or short and long-term prediction for the economy if these policies continue to exist?
Stagflation, recession, erosion of leadership, and ultimately much slower growth in standards of living.
I wanted to close by asking you, Larry, about what David Brooks wrote this morning in the New York Times. He said, it's time you talk about the Republican Party, and members of Congress speaking up. But David Brooks wrote this morning, quote, it's time for a comprehensive national civic uprising. It's time for Americans in universities, law, business, nonprofits, and the scientific community and civil servants and beyond to form one coordinated mass movement. Trump is about power. The only way he's going to be stopped is if he's confronted by some movement that possesses rival power. I give you that quote to set up this final question. What is the solution to stopping Donald Trump? And as one of my followers is asking, at what point do the guardrails come down completely and it's too late?
I think each of us in our own way has to try to find strength and attempt to throw sand in these gears and attempt to explain to everyone to whom we have access why this is a particularly dangerous moment. I think we need to do it in a way that suggests that our views are the product of calm reflection rather than of great excitement and intensity. That's why, for myself, I try to focus my comments near areas where I perhaps have expertise, like economics, like universities. And I try not to start making comparisons to Hitler and doing things of that kind, because I think that the greatest strength comes not from fighting extremism with counter extremism, but from a vast and broad center coming together. And that, I think David Brooks has a very powerful idea, and I think that leadership will need to come in each of the spheres he mentions, and then it will ultimately have to come together. But I am ultimately an optimist about the United States. Churchill did not actually say something that is often attributed to him, that the United States always does the right thing, but only after exhausting the alternatives. but I believe that ultimately we will see off uh, this threat, that we will learn as we have from our period with Joe McCarthy, as we have from the excesses of Watergate, as we have from the excesses of segregation. As we have from mistakes of defunding the police, that we are not a society who never steps unwisely, but we are a country that I believe has very, very great resilience. And I believe we will get to the other side of this, not by just assuming that that will happen, but through a lot of hard work, courage, and uh, real action by many, many people, that we will see ourselves through to a better day.
Well, that sounds nice, but I hope that some concrete steps are taken sooner rather than later. You know, everyone I interview, Larry, many of them say, "Oh, I'm an optimist. I think we'll get through this." But the longer uh, we wait, I think the more damage is done. And we need somebody to organize some counter effort that is cohesive and unified. I mean, what do I know? This is me as somebody who's been a journalist for many years, but it seems like, you know, the time for theoreticals is drawing dangerously near time to end theoreticals, and someone has to have some kind of organizing principle to stop what's happening from happening.
Much will depend upon what is brought to the courts, what the courts do, and our collective insistence, even if it means going into the streets, to insist that President Trump uh, respect the rule of law. And we all are going to be tested in important ways in the time ahead.
Larry Summers, you're such a great person to spend almost an hour with me on a Saturday morning. I really appreciate your insights, Larry. Thank you. I'm sure everyone watching is grateful for your time as well.
Thank you. It's an important time. Good to talk to you, Katie.
Thanks, Larry.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye, everyone. Enjoy your Saturday.